woven through the old alchemical texts that Carl Jung spent years untangling, is a strange and persistent figure that the alchemists and the mystics before them called by many names, though he was really always the same being. Sometimes they called him the primordial man, sometimes the first Adam before any fall from grace, sometimes simply the whole man, a figure so complete and so undivided that he contained within himself every quality a human being could possibly possess, male and female, both, light and dark both, spirit and matter both, spirit and matter both, all held together in a single perfect unity that existed, they believed, before the human race ever split apart into billions of separate and limited individuals. This figure was not thought of as merely a historical ancestor from the distant past. The old texts insist again and again that he is not gone. He is still here, hidden, they say, inside every single person who has ever lived, waiting quietly to be rediscovered. Jung found this idea extraordinary, not because he believed there had literally once been a single giant original human being from whom everyone else descended, but because the idea of a hidden, complete, whole self buried inside the fragmented ordinary personality kept appearing, in one disguise or another, across cultures and centuries that had no way of influencing one another directly. The Hebrew mystical tradition spoke of this figure. Ancient Gnostic writers described him in their own strange and elaborate visions. The alchemists inherited the idea and gave it their own chemical language, insisting that the treasure they sought in their laboratories was, at the deepest level, nothing other than a physical picture of this same primordial wholeness, waiting to be extracted from the raw and scattered material they worked with every day. What struck Jung most forcefully was the specific way this ancient figure was described. He was not simply larger or more powerful than an ordinary person. He was complete in a way no ordinary person ever manages to be. The old texts insist that before the fall, before the fragmentation that produced the human race as we know it, this original being contained every possible human quality within himself simultaneously, without any of the exhausting internal conflict that defines almost every ordinary person's daily experience. He was said to be both masculine and feminine at once, not one gender pretending to lack the other, but both fully present and fully integrated. He contained both the light and the dark sides of human nature, without needing to project one onto someone else in order to feel comfortable with himself. He held together every contradiction that an ordinary person spends their entire life trying to manage, and somehow, in this original state, none of those contradictions actually felt like contradictions at all. They were simply different facets of a single, seamless whole. Jung believed this figure represented something psychologically real and important, even though no historical person like this had ever actually existed. He came to see the primordial man as an ancient and remarkably accurate picture of what he later called the self, the deepest organizing center of the entire human psyche, which includes not just the narrow conscious personality a person normally identifies with, but the vast unconscious depths as well, the shadow qualities a person has never developed, the entire hidden range of human possibility that most people spend their whole lives never fully accessing. The primordial man was, in this understanding, a symbolic picture of total psychological wholeness, a state that no single individual in Jung's clinical experience ever fully and permanently achieves, but that nonetheless exists as a genuine potential inside every person, however far from realized it usually remains. This raises an obvious and important question. If this original wholeness truly exists inside every person, why does almost nobody ever actually experience it? Why does ordinary human life feel so consistently fragmented, so full of internal contradiction and exhausting inner conflict, rather than the seamless integration the old texts describe? The alchemical tradition offers an answer that Jung found genuinely useful, even stripped of its literal mythological framing. The process of simply becoming a distinct, functioning individual, developing a working ego, learning to survive and operate in a complicated social world, necessarily requires a kind of narrowing and specialization. A young child, psychologically speaking, is actually closer to the undifferentiated wholeness of the primordial figure than a mature adult usually is. But this early wholeness is unconscious, unformed, and incapable of surviving in the real world on its own. Growing up requires choosing, developing certain qualities while leaving others underdeveloped. Identify more strongly with certain aspects of your nature while pushing others into the shadow. This process is not a mistake or a tragedy. It is simply how a functioning individual identity gets built at all. But it does come at a real cost, and the cost is exactly the fragmentation the old alchemical texts describe, the sense of being only one part of something larger rather than the whole thing. The great work the alchemists devoted their entire lives to was, in this reading, an attempt to reverse this cost without simply abandoning the hard-won gains of individual identity in the process. They did not want to return to the unconscious, undifferentiated wholeness of early childhood, which the old texts often symbolize as a kind of chaos or formless raw material. They wanted something more difficult and more valuable, a second and fully conscious wholeness, achieved not by giving up the individual personality that had been so carefully built, but by patiently gathering back into conscious awareness all the qualities that had been left behind, rejected or projected outward during the long process of growing up. This is precisely the task Jung spent his career calling individuation, and he believed the old myth of the primordial man, however strange and fantastical its literal language might sound to modern ears, was one of the most accurate maps ever produced of exactly this psychological journey. There is something genuinely encouraging hidden inside this ancient idea, if you sit with it honestly. It suggests that the wholeness you might be quietly searching for, whether through relationships, achievement, spiritual practice, or simple hard-won self-understanding, is not something you have to manufacture entirely from scratch, building it piece by piece out of nothing. It is something you are trying to remember or rediscover, a completeness the old text insists was somehow always already there, hidden beneath the narrower and more fragmented identity that ordinary life has required you to build in order to survive and function at all. The primordial man is not a stranger you have never met. He is, according to this old and remarkably persistent tradition, simply the deepest and most complete version of yourself, patiently waiting under everything you have become for the long and difficult work of remembering to finally begin. This does not mean the work is easy, and the old alchemists were the first to admit how many attempts at their great labor ended in failure. But it does mean that the goal itself, however distant it might feel from your own daily experience of scattered and sometimes contradictory living, is not a foreign or artificial state you have to invent. It is, according to this ancient and widespread human intuition, simply a return, hard-won and never fully complete, to something that was, in some deep and mysterious sense, already yours from the very beginning. If you have ever had a fleeting moment when you felt genuinely whole, when the usual internal contradictions of your personality seemed to quiet down and something larger and more complete seemed briefly present instead, write below the single word for what that moment felt like. Naming even one glimpse of that wholeness is often the beginning of trusting that the old texts might have been describing something real, because the ancient story of a first and perfect human being was never really about the distant past at all. It was, the alchemists believed, a picture of something patiently waiting inside every single person alive today, a wholeness not yet remembered, still quietly gathering itself back together beneath the fragmented surface of an ordinary human life.